"It is unfortunate that you killed Colleen," he had told her. Grioge's sister married the chief of the Cambilaich. Leading the black-coated horse into her stall, she thought of that night. What else could she have done? The mare bent her head to her food, leaving a hefty deposit of gratitude at Osrith's feet. "You'll clean that." A voice behind her made her turn, as 3 warriors bore down on her, too late for Osrith to draw her blade. "Ye killed our lord," one continued, before lunging at her. Osrith ducked, 2 of the 3 men colliding with one another as she moved out of the way. The third barred her path, swinging an uppercut into her stomach. Osrith sagged. The wind knocked from her as one of the other men grabbed her legs, tumbling her to the floor. "Not his Aneb," one said, as the man who stood near her head. Her face, Osrith knew, in Cymraeg, presumably the voices skulking around outside Iona's fortifications. "He will need to look bonny for the king." There was menace in the voice, and she knew they were there to assault her for her killing. She scrabbled on the floor, but this seemed to infuriate them, and one knelt her face into the horse droppings. "Fight me, then." Osrith spluttered hoarsely, as she scrabbled for Buey. "Anglish," one of them declared, and another kicked her in the stomach again. "Don't let him up." She scrabbled on the floor, trying to avoid the blows. Osrith's hand was close to Buey, but before she could get purchase on its handle, she had been kicked once more. This time in the ball bag, or where her ball bag might have been if she had been a man. The second of confusion was enough. Launching herself at the men, she brought one down using the same tactic as one had used on her, toppling him like a tree flat onto his back into the straw. The mare she had ridden whinnied at the disturbance, stepping back on her hooves as the fight continued. Osrith scrabbled Buey from her scabbard, holding the blade defiantly as horse excrement slopped off her face. Their warrior to her left had withdrawn his too, and he hovered before her, his face drawing into a snarl. The second, shorter and stockier, had also withdrawn his weapon. Bastard Anglish. He launched himself at Osrith, who was quicker, and she ducked under his arm, whipping round and doubling back onto the taller man. But he was ready, and elbowed his sword arm back into her ribs. There was a sickening crunch. Osrith dropped to her knees, already a tightness in her chest grew as she struggled to ventilate her lungs. The taller man gloated as Osrith groped for Buey, on the floor before her. He made to stand on her hand, but Osrith was too fast for him, and slashed left, using a stable hook, lying behind him, on which the horse's hay was usually hung. It scraped the back of his leg, and he fell onto her. Or rather where Osrith had been, she had stretched right as the stockier man had thrust a fist in her direction, catching the hook quickly with force around his boot. He tried to shake her off but only succeeded in slipping on his other foot, off-balancing himself and crashing like a boulder to the floor. Osrith scooped up Buey just before he crashed onto it. She used her sword to help herself to her feet, staggering out of the stables, propping herself up outside, trying to breathe without the pain crushing in her chest. Then, she felt her face. At least the horse shit would come off, and Osrith made her way steadily to the kitchen then, thinking better of it. The men who had ambushed her may have friends, made her way to the burn they had passed as Domhnall had ridden the black mare back. She breathed, her chest feeling heavy. She had fought 3 of them, no need for another warrior, no need for a man, to protect her, or fight for her. And she had enjoyed fighting. Her experience with 9 fingers had not killed her will to battle. Osrith breathed deeply again. Not much to do for broken ribs, she thought as her feet got her to the rough path by the mountain bank, just rest them, but little chance if they were riding the next day. Just as she was reaching the beck, a flame of red hair streaked in her line of sight as Fergus got to his feet, letting go of the hands of a black-haired maid, who ran at the sight of Osrith. At the sight of Osrith covered in shit, Fergus began to laugh. She smiled too, despite the pain in her chest. "What's her name?" Osrith asked, as she sank her face into the fast-flowing water, grabbing at the waterweed and scrubbing at her face with it. "Ailey," he replied, as Osrith came up for air. She had never seen Fergus with a woman, nor even speaking of one. A late beginner, she surmised. "Is it all off?" "The shit?" Osrith nodded, and Fergus nodded too. She straightened up and proceeded to walk back the way she had come, her comrade in arms walking next to her. "How did you? Cleaning the stables. With your face?" He looked at her attire, and beauty, which was dull and dirty, and his brown eyes narrowed. "You've been in a fight?" he accused. But Osrith shushed him, as the commotion in the stable yard grew. He gave Osrith a "so you've already had your fun" look, before tearing off from her side, adding his blade to the ever-growing brawl that was taking place. Osrith peered round, catching sight of all three Cambulaic men who had ambushed her, watching them exchange blows with Griog's men. As she watched, Fergus had joined in, though fighting whom with whom was unclear, and behind him, Tagd's bright, fair hair glimmered. Eventually, as night began to fall, the fight petered out, and the men who had just been hammering one another hauled themselves into the hall for food. Osrith followed, with a bright, chatty Fergus and a worse-for-wear Tagd, who had been jumped on by three of Griog's men, giving as many thumps and kicks as he had received. Meat from recently butchered livestock, beef and mutton, was served, and a toast was made by Griog to his king with what Osrith heard to be water but was in fact Uistchbetha, welcome water, the pure which burned her throat and warmed her stomach as she joined in with the feast. As in Iona, Constantine sat with his brother and with Domhnall on a table with Griog and another man, who Osrith recognized as being one who had been with him creeping about outside Iona's monastery. Had they really been simply searching for Domhnall? Could Griog's explanation, that he thought the monastery overrun with Norse, be true? No matter how she considered it, sounded weak. They had brought Domhnall his finery and his throne, but had crept about thinking the occupants were Norse. That didn't make sense. They would have seen from the island's one tiny harbour no Norse ships, only the little coracles in which they had sailed from Ratlin. So why creep and ambush, risking deaths of your men if you knew it was only your king beyond the ramparts, and in prayer, too? A tale began, as Osrith took the ale jug from next to a very happy-looking Fergus, Inez Broglian, summer, and how Domhnall, aged 12, had stood next to Griog, his father Corstin and his uncle. The island off St. Andrews had been his first battle, when Harold Finehair had gone on to lay waste to Pitland, and how, since he had killed the mighty Ivarades, had disintegrated. Now the Scots posed a formidable foe. The Scots, thought Osrith. It was the first time she had heard that word, to describe an amalgamation of three distinct areas of Alba, and for each, once they had been to Dund, at the ceremony at Scone, Domhnall would be crowned king, the first king to rule equally, and as one, over all three. It was no wonder Eochaid had taken up arms against him, for one of those kingdoms was Strathclyde. Domhnall, no less, would be declaring his kingship over all of the lands above the Duide, putting into practice what Saenid MacAlpin, his grandfather, had begun. In the morning, Osrith expected, they would ride to Dund, moving in procession carefully, slowly and with precision, like Findlyarth and Flansinner, Muir's husband kings. It was the ritual and ceremony that would matter, for all to see a king moving through his land. Osrith could see, in her mind's eye, her lord, as he carried himself as such through the landscape, his long, black hair combed neatly and arranged over his blue cloak, Constantine and Domhnall just behind, Domhnall taller with his oval face as serious as that of his cousin, gleaming grey eyes taking in the Doriadan countryside, whereas Constantine, a little shorter, for he was younger than Domhnall, his nose more curled, his lips more serious, flanking Domhnall. Yet, he had been cursing at the king just that afternoon and, for all to hear, Domhnall had allowed him to. Osrith looked across to their table. In the tallow candlelight, she looked at the serious features of her former lover. He had barely spoken a word to her since Doia, nor tried to hump her, which was something Osrith was grateful for. Domhnall got to his unsteady feet, raising his tankard in praise of Griog and all the battles gone and to come. 3 lands of people had to accept him, Osrith thought, as Constantine sipped from his beaker too, the Gaels, the Picts and the Cymric. Strathclyde was by far the most difficult kingdom to rule, for not only Eochaid reigned but his kingdom claimed Cumbraland from the old times, from 300 years before, when the Romans left. but the Strathclyde Cymric were weak under Eochaid and Giric. Together they had struggled to defend Dunnottar, and had been pushed into retreat into the castle by two Danes leading their own army up from Eoferwick. The brothers were defeated, but Eochaid and Giric lost many men and the alliance between the Cymric and the Picts was all but broken. Domhnall had told them this as they were under sail from mile away from being overheard. It always came down to Strathclyde. How was Domhnall to solve that problem? Now is the time to attack, he had declared. The brothers have gone south to fight the Northumbrians, although there will always be others. And then, as singing began, Greogair's eyes met hers. Osrith realized, as she looked away, that the man had been staring at her for some time. As Osrith excused herself, citing the early start in the morning, she noticed, to her horror, that Greogair made to rise too. Osrith's heart beat fast. Why was he getting up too? Did he want to speak to her? Had he sent the Cambilaich on her? But then Domhnall pushed him back into his chair and filled up his tankard, hand on his ally's shoulder, clearly happily inebriated and insisting his friend join him. But his eyes were on her, as she left the hall and headed to the hay loft, where the warriors would sleep. The night was cold, which suggested a fresh morning the next day. They were to camp overnight at another stronghold belonging to Greogair next to Dund, before Domhnall's coronation. Osrith inhaled deeply of the crisp evening air. She would have to go back in and up the ladder through the hayloft hatch to reach the straw, rather than the quicker vault up the side of the wall. No matter how much she pretended, she really was in quite a bit of pain from the kicking and beating she had taken. As she made her way past the horses, the black mare she had ridden that afternoon with Domhnall, the two skewballs and half or dozen of single color, white, black and brown, she paused, wondering if it was the mare she would be riding the next day, or another of these. Would she stay on? Would she be able to control the horse? Those behind Muir at Findlaith's funeral had walked slowly and not cantered away like the mare that afternoon. She supposed She supposed what? A noise had made Osrith stop extrapolating her king's motives on his procession in the morning. Being her, the horses, asleep, moved their hooves with a soft clatter, puffing quietly their soporific breath. And there was the noise again, one of leather on stone. Someone was following her. But who? The leather scraped stone again and Osrith silently withdrew away from her fleece-lined scabbard. Her mind's first thought was that Constantine had followed her, to play a childish trick on her, and she stood silently, her breath as quiet as she could make it while her lungs pushed against her broken ribs. Who else could it be? "Do not sleep tonight, English boy," a voice came suddenly, but the speaker did not move any closer to Osrith. "For you killed our lord, do not sleep any night." And then, a quick sound of boots turning on stone left Osrith alone at the bottom of the ladder to the hay loft, holding her sword. But still she turned to shout, though no words took form. "I was doing my lord's work." Osrith wanted to scream, "I was protecting my lord from harm." And Osrith didn't sleep, or at least, she thought she wouldn't. Her body ached too much to get comfortable in the first place, and her heart was racing, her mind overwhelmed with thoughts. Secondly, the man who had threatened her was clearly one of those, or kin of, the men who had deliberately pursued her that evening. They hadn't forgotten. Indeed, they sounded more determined to harass her, Osrith, the boy they thought her to be. Instead, she listened to the sounds of the night, of the hall, still filled with laughter and singing, of an owl hooting not far from the burn, the moon passing through a gap in the wooden wall of the stables, only to ebb away as it moved higher.